reflects as well. One of the things I think it does, the deeper things it reflects, is there is a desire, I think, a growing appetite for democratic change in Scotland. And it's obvious where much of this is coming from. In Scotland we've been used for so long now to getting the government that we vote for maybe 2 or 3 times in a generation, if we're lucky. And clearly that's not how democracy, even liberal democracy, works in other countries. In other countries, the majority of voters get the governments that they vote for in every single general election, not just 2 or 3 times in a generation as in Scotland. I think broadly it will be interesting to see what an independent Scotland does with this kind of newfangled concept that the rest of the world knows as democracy, because I think it's going to be a novelty to a lot of people in Scotland. It's not something we're used to. You vote and you get the government that you vote for.
Wow.
But I think obviously for the left, and I think looking at some of the blogs, left-oriented blogs in Scotland, there's a much more ambitious agenda than simply a change of personnel. It's much deeper than that. And I think, again, this feeds into some of the things we were talking about previously, that I think there is not only a growing appetite for democratic change in Scotland, I think there is a growing recognition that independence is the only way we're going to get democratic change in Scotland. Whether it's a true democratic transformation, maybe it's important not to overstate this point, because I think it will take some time, but I think just liberating ourselves from the British state and the undemocratic practices and institutions of the British state will be a democratic transformation in itself.
Do you think as well as a democratic transformation there's going to be a demographic transformation? Because in part we've been told that, with an independent Scotland, all these hundreds of thousands of people are going to go back to Scotland, and there should also be different rules about immigration. The immigration policy has a lot of problems, things like Dungavel is a permanent embarrassment.
Sure.
But do you think, as well as the democratic situation, the demographic situation might change?
Well, if you listen to the No campaign, independence will bring capital flight, mass migration from Scotland.
But all the terrorists are going to come.
Yeah, and the terrorists as well. Yeah, that's an important point. The point you make about demographic change and the impact of independence on the demographics of Scotland. Because again, we were talking earlier about how Scotland urgently needs its own migration policy, and I think one point we didn't make, of course, is that the UK is currently adopting a closed door policy on immigration. And given that Scotland was disadvantaged when the UK had a relatively open policy on migration, attracting such a low proportion of UK migrants, I think people in Scotland need to think about how Scotland is going to be affected when the UK adopts this, as it is, this closed policy of migration. It's going to have a pretty devastating impact in Scotland, not just in the next couple of years, but for the next 2, 3, 4 decades, at precisely the time when a Scottish government should be instituting its own migration policy geared to attracting more young skilled migrants to Scotland, among other things. So I think that's that demographic change is important. Whether thousands or hundreds of thousands of Scots will come back to Scotland from after independence, I think remains to be seen. I think obviously you have to be very careful. One of the reasons that I think I would emphasise that Scotland needs a managed migration policy is because clearly you need to have the infrastructure in place in order to absorb an increase in migrants. And one of the things that I think is noticeable in terms of England's experience, and I think we did touch on this earlier, about how England's experience of migration, particularly in the post-war period, is very different from Scotland's. One of the things we need to note is that migration does affect different people, different classes in different ways. And for a well-to-do middle-class family, a migrant is a potential employee, a cleaner, a nanny, a gardener. But for many working-class communities in England, a migrant is someone who will potentially undercut wages, maybe even take their job away. And of course the Tories and New Labour have been playing this card. One of the reasons I think we said earlier Ed Miliband went to Peterborough was because places like Peterborough in England have been captured by the Tories. They've also been affected by the racial tensions that the far right, the BNP and the English Defence League have been conducting for several decades.
Don't worry, George Galloway's here to sort it all out.
Well, sure, I don't think even George could sort this out, but the point is, when Ed Miliband made the point in his speech that New Labour got its immigration policy wrong, what he was effectively saying to Peterborough and places like it, and particularly in the east of England and the south of England, is that if Labour gets back into power, it will be just as tough on immigration as the Tories are. That's the only way that Labour can win back these Tory voters and these white working class communities, some of whom, not all of whom obviously, some of whom have turned to the far right. And I think the only way that any political party in England can appeal to the far right, obviously, is by being tougher on immigration and being seen to be tough on immigration. The consequences of that, of course, for immigrants and migrants themselves are pretty bleak, because it will, although it's not the intention of Labour or even the Tories for that matter, it will inflame racism in England. There's no question about that. That's what it's been doing for several decades now. That's why it's been, many of these communities are such fertile territory for the far right. So before Scotland accepts an influx of migrants, even a relatively small influx, we need to make sure we have the infrastructure in place, and that's why a managed migration policy is very important. Otherwise, Scotland could find itself going through what many communities in England have gone through.
That infrastructure wouldn't only involve housing stock. Things like if you're talking about capital investment from the government, that's one of the ways that an independent Scotland could be seen to be like a beacon. You can come and you're not going to get crap wages, and you're not going to get put in a shit house, and you're not, this is one of the ways that there could be a population increase, a managed immigration policy, helping Scotland's population, and being like a progressive beacon, I think.
That's what Sweden has done. Sweden has seen a significant increase in its population in the last 12, 13 years. Okay, Sweden doesn't have a bona fide social democratic government in place anymore, but nevertheless, it still has many of the policies intact. The corporatism is still there, the welfare state is still there, and in spite of that, or because of that, Sweden has attracted more people to Sweden. And again, compare that to Scotland's experience. Scotland's population has barely shifted in the whole post-war period. And again, that's part of the price that Scotland has paid for being part of the UK. But for me, the most compelling argument for independence is what we were discussing earlier. Independence would start the process, and it would only start this process of disengaging Scotland from British economic imperialism and the ongoing crisis management of the British state and British capitalism.
Okay, excellent. And a very short final question. How are you going to celebrate if we win?
Well, actually, one of my best friend in Edinburgh died 2 years ago of cancer. It was a huge shock to all of us. And we used to have discussions about independence and devolution. He wasn't he didn't share a lot of my politics, did share some of them, but he was certainly much more sympathetic to independence than some other friends. Less so nowadays, of course. But anyway, one of the things I would do is, because he loved to take his dog up Arthur Seat, and luckily my sister lives in the shadow of Arthur Seat, so on the morning after independence, I would take a bottle of whiskey up Arthur Seat and drink it, and that would be one way I would definitely celebrate independence. There would be other celebrations as well, but I would do that for my mate Rob. That's definitely number one.
Okay, thanks very much, Donald Adamson.
Thank you, Michael. My pleasure.
So there you go. That was great, wasn't it? It's always a pleasure to listen to someone who knows what they're talking about, so it must have been good for him to meet me. No, sorry, I'm joking. I couldn't resist that one. So yeah, I just wanted to say thanks. For our first 4 episodes, at the time I'm recording this, we've already had way over 2,000 listens, so thanks to all of you for listening. All of the retweets and Facebook likes and everything that you've been doing is great. Please keep it up. Try and tell another person about the podcast. If you've got anything you'd like to contribute, please let me know. If there's someone you think I should speak to, let me know about that as well. To finish today, we've got the Workers' Song by Dick Gaughan, who kindly let us use it. The song was also the request of Donald Adamson. So hope you've enjoyed it, and I'll speak to you next time.
Who toil night and day by hand and by brain to earn your pay, who for centuries long past for no more than your bread have bled for your countries and counted your dead in the factories and mills, in the shipyards and mines. We've often been told to keep up with the times, but our skills are not needed. They've streamlined the job, and with slide rule and stopwatch our blind they'll rob die. But when the sky darkens and the prospect is war, who's given a gun and then pushed to the fore and expected to die for the land of our birth, though we've never owned one handful of earth? We're the first ones to starve, we're the first ones to die, we're the first ones in line for that pie in the sky, and we're always the last when the cream is shared out, for the worker is working when the fat cat's about. Aye, and all of these things the worker has done, from tilling the fields to carrying the gun. We've been yoked to the plough since time first began, aye, and always expected to carry the can.